This is Michael Welch for the Global Research Show. It's my very special privilege to introduce Brian Peckford. He's a Canadian politician. He served as the Premier of Newfoundland from March 26, 1979 to March 22nd, 1989. He's a member of the Progressive Conservative Party. He's challenging the government's restrictions on civil liberties as they try to control the COVID pandemic. And he's also the last living signatory to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Based on his thorough understanding of the issues of rights surrounding that document, you would think he would be more visible in media these days, but he is not. He talks to us now about the planned vaccine mandates, and particularly around the Freedom Convoy of truckers from last year and the findings of the Emergencies Act Inquiry that supposedly settled that matter. It's a pleasure having you here, Mr. Peckford. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here.
So all the restrictions that we saw over the last 3 years was an attempt to keep everyone safe, they say. Their communicable diseases could fester if we don't have restrictions. I mean, so we introduced lockdowns, restrictions on traveling freely, gathering, restricting the vaccinated, etc. And this seems to be supported by the higher bodies, the World Health Organization, and all. So from a Charter of Rights and Freedoms perspective, I don't know, is this something? I mean, is there a problem with restricting rights in some cases for the sake of public health?
Yeah, I think what has happened over the last 3 years when this so-called COVID came along is that the governments panicked around the world and were fed a lot of incorrect information and therefore responded through fear and through panic and started to institute policies which were unconstitutional. Unconstitutional in the sense that they violated the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is part of the Constitution. It's part of the Constitution Act of 1982, which I helped create. I'm the only person, First Minister left, who was part of that process. I don't know, I was the youngest at the time, but I was one of the younger First Ministers, and I guess that's why it's only me left as one of the signatories to that foundational document. So what has happened is that the governments of Canada, all the governments of Canada, have instituted policies allegedly to mitigate the negative consequences of a so-called pandemic with overreaching mandates and lockdowns which violate the Charter. And they violate the Charter Section 2, Section 6, Section 7, Section 15, all of which deal with freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of travel, equality before the law, and all of that. And so our rights and freedoms are being violated. Now, there was a provision in the Charter which says on a short-term basis, you can do this, violate the rights and freedoms of Canadians if you can demonstrably justify it's necessary and do it through a free and democratic society. And this is where I have issue. None of the governments of Canada have demonstrably justified that this was necessary. And therefore, they're violating the Constitution just by saying we are protecting you as if they were the big daddy or the nanny state can protect you. We're doing it for your own good, and we know better than you. Well, we know where that leads, as George Orwell told us eloquently many decades ago. And so the governments have gotten away with this because essentially over the last 4 decades or more, the governments of Canada and around the world for that matter, but in this case we're talking Canada, and the judiciary have sort of married into a narrative whereby the Constitution is not what was written. It is as we now interpreted it along the lines of what we think should be, how it should be interpreted in light of the circumstances of today. We don't have in our country, in Canada, like they do in the United States, a group of justices and a group of lawyers who believe in the original document called originalism, and therefore they feel they are at liberty to change the Constitution, forgetting that in our Constitution it says you're only supposed to interpret, not make new laws. But the courts have decided that they can interpret the Constitution in a way which also violates existing original definitions of the Constitution and bring about their own new ones. And I object to that because there is an amending formula for amending the Constitution. And any democracy worth its salt is one where the people change the Constitution, not unelected judges or even elected parliaments. They can only do it through the people and through the amending formula. And they have not used that amending formula. They have not tried to change the Constitution to see whether people agree with amending it along the lines they want. And so there's the great argument. I am now in Canada almost alone in arguing this point. I have taken out a legal action against the federal government for their travel mandate, which violates the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And I took that action through the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, which is an organization which helps individuals across the country fight government tyranny and unconstitutional measures. That's still before the courts. I've lost. Myself and others who are part of the litigation have lost the first round in that to the Federal Court of Canada, and now we've appealed it to the Federal Court of Appeal. And we are now submitting documents for that appeal. So I've sort of not only advocated that this is happening, but I've taken action on that to demonstrate my credibility in articulating this point of view. But most courts to date have sided with the governments and allowed the governments to violate our Constitution and our Charter on the premise that this is for the greater good of the country, even though they haven't proved this to be so. As a matter of fact, as we now know, science has proven that it's not for the greater good of the country, nor was it ever for the greater good of the country. But they have ignored independent science, they have ignored reason, and moved ahead unilaterally and totalitarian way to restrict our rights under this so-called public health mantra.
Yeah, well, a professor friend of mine, he's a media commentary, he does media commentaries, and he's been very critical of the Freedom Convoy of truckers, saying that, well, they're not really fighting for their freedoms and their rights and their freedoms. They're fighting for their privileges and entitlements. You know, the sense is that if they infect, I mean, if they have their right to be unvaccinated, but they could impose on someone else who's more vulnerable, and they could die as a result. You know, so I mean, as someone who's as an architect of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, what would you say to that kind of argument?
Well, the first thing I would use a science argument, because what the commentator is saying defies the science. We know that vaccinated people for COVID can transmit COVID the same as unvaccinated people. And as a matter of fact, there's a big body of evidence now that the vaccinated can shed the virus to unvaccinated people. So the evidence today completely defies the fact that unvaccinated are of more danger to the society than the vaccinated. That cannot now be sustained in science. Number two, if in fact the professor and commentator was right, there's a means by which the governments can argue their point, and that's demonstrably justify, as is required under Section 1 of the Charter. As David Redmond in Alberta, who used to be head of the Emergency Measures Organization there, has written innumerable articles and studies which show that the governments have not demonstrated, demonstrably justified their position on implementing all of this. There is a professor at Simon Fraser University also who has done two studies now, one back in 2001, in which he showed most of the authorities around the world knew back in 2020 that the cure was going to be worse than the disease, but ignored it. And he followed that up with a study this past year in which he provided greater information to sustain that argument. So, and even before COVID came, it was known that mandates, lockdowns, and masks didn't work. A great epidemiologist several years before had written a big report indicating that from all around the world, from earlier pandemics, epidemics, whatever, dealing with infectious diseases, that this could not be justified as a means to mitigate any infectious epidemic or pandemic. And so I think your friend, commentator, professor needs to revisit the science and revisit the fact that the Section 1 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms has not been satisfied.
The Freedom Convoy of Truckers has basically alienated the politicians, a lot of politicians, as well as members of the public. And it was seen as potentially violent. And then, you know, there was a lot of talk about, you know, hatred and such. And, you know, was there a human rights perspective to invoke the Emergencies Act? This is something that's not going to go away, and it could turn violent. I mean, Mr. Trudeau even said, well, if I don't invoke the Emergencies Act, then maybe, you know, and something does happen. Well, that falls on that fault falls on me for not stopping it earlier.
You can't rule by anticipation. You can't rule by guesstimate, number one. Number two, all of the information that's come out through the parliamentary hearings before the Rouleau Commission, and now since the Rouleau Commission, has indicated that there was no risk of violence. Even CSIS itself and the other police authorities in Ottawa, both RCMP and the Ontario Police, have under oath testified there was no risk. The majority of the provinces indicated that this was unnecessary. So there's no real hard evidence to support the idea that there was a high risk or even a medium risk or even a low risk of violence, which therefore justified the invocation of the Emergencies Act. It's just not there. And so this is all speculation. When one uncovers and looks at the facts, all of the data under oath that has been presented demonstrates that this was an overreaction by the government of Canada. And by the way, the Emergencies Act itself is subject to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And once again, the government did not demonstrably justify that this was necessary.
Well, what did you think about the refusal of Trudeau to meet or talk with any of the protesters?
totally undemocratic. I'm quite familiar with this, by the way, because my lawyer at the time was also the lawyer for the truckers. Matter of fact, he was my lawyer, contracted by the Justice Center before the truckers convoy began. And when the truckers convoy people came looking for a lawyer, they wanted to get the lawyer I had, and he was under agreement with me and the other people who were part of my litigation. So we had to give our lawyer approval to become also the lawyer for the trucker, which we did. And so I'm quite familiar with this. And because the lawyer was the intervener, if you will, making propositions and proposals on behalf of the truckers to the government and to the City Council of Ottawa. And they had asked peacefully for a delegation, not for meeting on the streets and trying to negotiate in that kind of way, but into a reasonable way of sitting down and talking about this situation and how we could both come to some kind of mutually agreeable way forward. And at each occasion, the government refused, and so did the opposition, by the way. So there's blood going all around here. It's not just the Trudeau government. It's the Conservative government and the NDP party and the NDP party. They all refused to get involved until, of course, later it got popular. And then the Conservatives started to move a little bit in the direction of the truckers, but only after it became more popular. Early on, they refused to meet. So there's just no evidence to demonstrate that the violence was pending. There's evidence, by the way, by a senator who testified before the Rouleau Commission that her office overlooked the street, the Wellington Street, and she was there all through this period, and she saw nothing and walked the streets. And I did too, there for 4 days, consequential. Matter of fact, the truckers were helping the police. And on a number of occasions, the lawyer had an agreement with the City Council of Ottawa, which they broke, to move trucks further away from the residential area and just on Wellington Street, the more commercial area. And they helped the police get people to hospital and all the rest of it, and made sure the streets were clear. So there's no evidence to demonstrate that there was any risk to safety in Ottawa. And this is a myth. And this is the most astounding part of Mr. Rouleau's conclusions, notwithstanding the fact that the evidence was overwhelming, that this was an unnecessary act, and but also unconstitutional, which he didn't deal with, by the way, because it didn't meet the tests of the Charter. But even if it met the tests of the Charter, it could not be justified on the ground because there was no risk. And so, but by the way, you might be interested to know, and your viewers might be interested to know, that my lawyer also submitted my name to be one of the witnesses at the Rouleau Commission, even though I had opposed it on grounds of the Charter. But he submitted my name because I was in Ottawa. I spoke to the truckers on Parliament Hill with others, that I met with the board of the truckers convoy, Terum Leish's convoy, truckers convoy. They had a board of directors. They had a finance committee. They were well organized. They weren't a ragtag group of people. They were incorporated, all the rest of it. And I met with their board, and Tamara and I had a press conference foreshadowing, because we had something leaked to us that the government was going to go ahead and invoke the Emergencies Act. So we had a press conference before the government did that. So I was very familiar with the truckers convoy people, their board, Tamara herself, and through my lawyer, which was a lawyer for both me and my group, if you will, and the truckers. And Mr. Rouleau and the commission turned down, refused to grant me status to be a witness at the Rule Commission. And notwithstanding that I was there, addressed it, was involved with the leadership of the truckers, and was the only living signatory to the charter, which was under attack here, they still refused permission for me to appear. And to add to that, the court case that's ongoing in the federal court, that's already ruled that because the travel mandate is not there anymore, therefore no need to hear this case, even though almost 6 million Canadians were refused the right to travel for several months, as if that didn't matter. My lawyer posed a question to the Government of Canada lawyers in a recess one day between, in the court action. When do you anticipate calling Mr. Peckford to the stand to cross-examine him and his statement of claim against your client? Oh, we don't intend to call Mr. Peckford. So, and other lawyers in Canada fighting these mandates and lockdowns also had statements from me and presented them to the court, and the court refused. These provincial Supreme Courts also refused to hear me. So, and the press in Canada, early on, when they saw what my position was, they have refused to carry my articles. And so I have a blog, peckford42.wordpress.com, which gets thousands of people every day. And that's how I get my word out, and also speaking on Zoom, especially across Canada, to people like yourself.
What did you see as fundamentally wrong with the inquiry right from the start?
The Conservative government of, I think it was Brian Mulroney at the time, had changed the War Measures Act to the Emergencies Measures Act. It wasn't the Liberal government, it was the Conservative. And by the way, I've been a Conservative all my life up to a few years ago. I mean, a Conservative in the sense of a member of a Conservative party. I'm no longer a member of any of these parties, these mainstream parties. I quit, I resigned, I don't support them anymore. But I did at the time that this happened, by the way. So I accept my part of not doing anything about it at the time. I wasn't a federal politician, but I still should have spoke up. But I didn't even know about at the time that when they changed the War Measures Act, there was a provision in there which said that if in fact a subsequent government has to invoke this act, immediately after its invocation, and when it's no longer in operation, Parliament will cause an inquiry to be held to investigate whether the government was correct in doing this. But they made a big mistake in that new legislation. They put in the government could examine itself. In other words, the legislation said, once the invocation is over and we establish an inquiry, the government will establish the terms of reference. The government will appoint a commissioner. So here we had a conflict of interest of the government examining itself. A person commits a crime or allegedly commits a crime and then can decide whether in fact they are guilty or not. That's what happens. So the fundamental flaw in the Rule Commission is in its creation, in its very creation. All the rest of it is immaterial because it is invalid from day one, because how can a government investigate itself? How can anybody investigate its own alleged crimes? Yeah. And so, and I, by the way, pointed this out, obviously to my lawyer, but on my blog and to many interviews that I've had. And this is the sadness of Canada right now, is that nevertheless, even though all of these lawyers all of these think tanks, all of these other people in Canada who appeared before the commission, none of them raised the point, Mr. Commissioner, you are illegitimate. I'm here to, and of course, that's one of the reasons, I guess, why Rouleau did not accept me as a witness, because he suspected that what I was going to do was look him straight in the eye and say, Mr. Commissioner, with all due respect to you and your past as a justice and all the rest of it, why would you accept a position to be a commissioner for a government, not the parliament, but for the parliament giving away its power to the government? Why would you accept the position of commissioner for the government to examine the government's alleged sins and violations? Why would you do that? So you are, from day one, this commission is illegitimate. So Canada collectively has a problem with itself. It continues to perpetrate ideas and actions which are illegitimate. Rouleau Commission, illegitimate. I was a part in helping to set up the National Citizens Inquiry, which is underway right now, turned illegitimate when Preston Manning, the spokesman for the group, violated the main reason why we were establishing a National Citizens Inquiry by accepting a government position, $250,000, to lead at the same time as he was involved with the National Citizens Inquiry, a government inquiry. And that Alberta inquiry is illegitimate too. Even though I supported Daniel Smith to become the leader, but they didn't go to the legislature. It's a government inquiry, a government examining itself. So you've got the Rouleau Commission, illegitimate, because it's trying to examine itself, conflict of interest. You got the National Citizens Inquiry, where one of the people on the board of the nonprofit corporation establishing the National Citizens Inquiry violates one of the principles setting up the National Citizens Inquiry, which was to be independent, and takes at the same time a paid position with a government inquiry, which itself is illegitimate because it didn't go to the legislature. Wow. So that's the state we're in Canada. Now, nobody wants to hear this. Right? Nobody wants to hear this. And I'm glad that you are prepared and your people that you represent are willing to listen to what I just said.
Yeah, well, could you tell me, generally speaking, having been at the site and even having a press conference with one of the leaders, taking a look around, what did you think about the Freedom Convoy itself? Well, what was maybe a special moment there that really affects your view, overall view?
I think what I saw was like 30 below, snow on the ground, cold. What I saw, which affected me most, two things. One, walking the streets to Wellington Street, talking to people, many at home from across Canada who recognized me and knew I was coming to speak that day, shaking my hand. From people, from intellectuals to farmers, to tradesmen, to housewives, to students, to you name it. The cross section of the country that was represented in that walk was amazing. And afterwards, after the speeches, mingling with the people was amazing. And how genuine and authentic they were. Ordinary people. That really strikes a chord with me because I come from rural Newfoundland. And I was born and raised in small communities. the largest community that I was a part of growing up was around 3,000 people. That was the largest. I was born in a community of 400 or 500. And I went to school there, and I went to school in another community of about 1,200. And I graduated from high school in a community of about 3,000. And so I grew up with fishermen, loggers, and miners, mainly, besides people who worked in the retail business in those small communities. So, as they say in Newfoundland, I'm a bayman of the first order. I come from the bay. I come from rural Newfoundland. And so seeing these people from rural Manitoba, northern Ontario, and all over Saskatchewan and Alberta, and from Quebec and the Maritimes and Newfoundland, gathered there with no axe to grind, except to fight for what they believe to be their right to protest and to have an opportunity for the truckers to be heard by their elected representatives. And over again, that was the words and phrases that I heard from these people, unprovoked by me. Secondly, was meeting the board of the truckers. Truckers from all over Canada. Ordinary people again. Reasonable people sitting down in a boardroom in a hotel, and all around you. And they, when I walked into the room, they all came and shook my hand and thanked me for coming and so on. And so I sat down with these people, both individually and on twos and threes, and then as a board. Well, there's no way any Canadian could not be impressed with the authenticity of these people. They were just ordinary people with bank loans and mortgages and children and schooling, as every other ordinary Canadian, but got triggered when all of a sudden they were told by the government that in order for you to continue to prosecute your business, to transport those goods across the border, you were going to have to be forced to be injected with an experimental vaccine. And that is the only way that could qualify. You were to lose your charter rights. And they didn't understand. They did. And, you know, they were sort of the people who really sort of realized that, well, have you proven anything? Have you proven this is necessary? You know, a very basic thing, right? Well, you know, Mr. Peckford, you're speeding. I just caught you speeding. Oh, did you now, Mr. Police Officer? Well, in what manner did you catch me? Can you prove that I was speeding? You must prove that. Oh, well, I got you on technology. You know, I got you on a laser beam. Well, perhaps that laser beam wasn't working properly. Perhaps we need to examine that. Perhaps that was a faulty. You only got one reading. Perhaps it's a faulty reading. In the same way, this is the basic stuff of the trucker, right? You're telling me, and I know of vaccines that have hurt people over the years. Nobody's talked about it. It's been very quiet. But people have gotten hurt and injured by other vaccines, and you're suddenly telling me this thing, which is experimental, for which the creators of the vaccine have no liability if anything goes wrong, that I am to take this. And more than one trucker came at the issue that way. It was basic, fundamental common sense. This did not pass the smell test of common sense. And so those two things really struck me. Of course, as others have said, the camaraderie, the getting together, helping out people, helping out one another. As a matter of fact, the truckers actually went to the police on one night and said there's either the Black Lives Matter or some other group we suspect from the United States, but they might have people in Canada who just destroyed our tires, took the air out of our tires and destroyed our trucks, hit our trucks. The next day, the police reported that the truckers were destroying property, only to have to admit that that was wrong. It wasn't the truckers. The truckers came to them to tell them about other people outside of the trucker movement who had infiltrated it. And the police were able to prove that afterwards. But it's like something in the paper today about you alleging you did A, and then 2 days or 3 days later on the back page of the paper, the editors apologized because they were wrong in their story. Well, the first story is out there. Very few saw the second story. And that's like what happened to the truckers. The police were late coming to admit that they were wrong. And when they did, of course, the mainstream media who were on the side of the government and against the truckers either never carried it or carried it in a manner where it was not obvious to the general public.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to stop it there. Brian Peckford, I really am delighted to have you on. Thank you so much for appearing in this presentation.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to have done this, and I thank you for your invitation.